Quentin Atkinson is a former student of Mark Bagel, who we heard this morning. He was the one that proved together, in collaboration, they proved that punctuated equilibria is a pattern that we can also distinguish in language evolution. He was also part in our group at San Francisco for the AAA. Currently, he's a senior lecturer at the School of Psychology at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. And he works on phylogenetic methods from within both biology and sociocultural sciences. And he's going to talk about tracing human cultural ancestry in time and space.
Okay. I had intended to talk about a number of different empirical studies that I've done looking at this question, cultural ancestry in time and space, but I've decided I don't have enough time to do that. So I'm just going to focus on one empirical study that I haven't had a chance to present before, so I thought that might be interesting, and I think it's kind of relevant to this meeting. So a lot of my previous work, as Natalie said, has involved applying phylogenetic methods from biology to linguistics. So this is a family tree of the Indo-European languages that I put together with Russell Gray, pictured there. And we built this from lexical data, so words in the different languages, and analyzed the data using phylogenetic methods borrowed from biology. And you get sensible groupings reconstructing the major language groups, and we were able to test between two hypotheses for the origin of the Indo-European language family. And I think we can learn a lot about cultural change using these methods. Am I going to get my next slide? This is one of my favorite papers, taking a language lineage, this time the Austronesian language tree, and reconstructing ancestral traits on it. So Fiona Jordan here maps whether the different Austronesian societies here were matrilocal, patrilocal, or ambilocal, and then reconstructed the ancestral states, which we can't get from the archaeological record. And she called this virtual archaeology, which I quite like. But lots of aspects of culture don't fit this phylogenetic model very well, or we don't know how well they fit it. As Frank was saying today, he gave some different examples of that. So unlike most of biological evolution or eukaryotic evolution, where we have a nice family tree, like on the left there, cultural evolution might be much more reticulate. Rob Boyd, I like his idea of a spectrum here. So it's not that we necessarily have a particular type of reticulate evolution and then a particular type of phylogenetic evolution and there's no other options. There's a spectrum of possibilities. So there's processes going on that blur the picture of what would look like clear descent with modification. So if you've got high rates of innovation within cultures, within individuals, within cultures, then you'll have a lot of diversity in cultures, and so you can't account for that diversity with a family tree model of differences between cultures. And also you can have geographic diffusion of traits, which is going to muddy what might otherwise be a clear descent with modification picture. So we have the spectrum where at one end you've got cohesive cultural packages that might have evolved via descent with modification, and at the other end there's more ephemeral collections of traits. And there's nothing to say that one of these is right or wrong for all of culture. We expect them to apply to different aspects of culture in different ways. Phylogenetics works well for cultural divergence, for traits that maybe there's less influence of diffusion, so some aspects of language are like that, but not all cultural traits. So what do we do, or how might we investigate non-phylogenetic cultural evolution? Well, we can draw on another branch of Darwinian thinking, which is population genetics. And some people are beginning to do this, taking inspiration from population genetics to look at cultural variation across landscapes. So that you can compare models of mutation, selection, gene flow, and drift to empirically observed distributions of genes in population genetics. And you can test models of change against the observed distribution. For example, neutral evolution or selection, different mutation rates or gene flow, and gain an understanding of, or try to gain an understanding of the processes that have generated the diversity you see. So one of the approaches, and I'm going to talk about this later with regard to culture, is that you can quantify within versus between population variation using what's called an analysis of molecular variance. And this can tell us something about how much gene flow there is between populations, or it's also related to the rate of mutation, and whether we're really dealing with distinct populations or some mixture, something more ephemeral. There's also a spatial element to population genetics. This is one of my favorite population genetics papers. It's by John November at UCLA, and he took a large data set of SNPs data, single nucleotide polymorphisms from across Europe, extracted the first and second principal components from that data, and just plotted them, and he published it in Nature. And the reason he did that is because he got a really interesting pattern, which was that you kind of get back what looks like a map of Europe. I don't know if you can see that, but the different points here are colored according to their color on this map of Europe. And you get something like a map of Europe back. Because there's, he argues, this process of isolation by distance going on, such that, so there's this kind of mixing that's been going on in Europe for the last few thousand years. So the main axes of variation are the main geographic axes. And you also get this pattern. The graph on the right there shows distance between any two individuals and their, the correlation between their genetic, their SNPs data. And so you get this pattern of increasing difference as distance increases. So you can also detect departures from isolation by distance processes here. So this graph shows the correlation between geographic distance and genetic distance, and these points here are on the same side of the Himalayas, and these points are on the opposite side of the Himalayas. So you can see the clear evidence of this geographic boundary causing a stepped change in genetic difference. So I thought it would be interesting to apply these ideas to some kind of cultural variation, and with a graduate student, Robert Ross, he managed to find a wonderful collection of 700 folk tales. The particular collections, they're all versions of the tale of the kind and unkind girl. And for those of you who don't know the story, there's two sisters, one nasty and one nice, and they're set a series of tasks. The nice sister completes them and asks for a modest reward. The nasty sister sees this, tries to emulate it, but cuts corners and asks for an exorbitant reward. And in the end, through various means, the nice sister's reward turns out to be really valuable, and the nasty sister never gets her reward, or it turns out to be worthless, or sometimes fatal. So this was interesting to us because folktales are complex packages of culturally transmitted beliefs. They're often been used in philosophical discussions about cultural evolution. I know Dan Sperber, who's in the audience here, has written about them. And they can and do vary between cultures and within cultures. And in this data set, we have multiple variants from each ethno-linguistic group, and we know the location, the exact location where that variant came from. So that makes it possible to potentially untangle the effects of the culture that a folktale's in from its geographic location. Also, this data is collected in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which means it's slightly less influenced by more recent large-scale human migration patterns and mass media and modern communication and that kind of thing. And also, the data has been independently coded using this established, what's called the geographic historic method. So we didn't code the data ourselves. So the questions we wanted to look at were how much variation do we see within versus between cultures, and how does this compare to human genetic variation? Does individual folktale variation show any geographic patterning? Is it the variation we see purely clinal? So is it geographic, like that isolation by distance pattern in genetics? Or do ethno-linguistic groups present a barrier to folktale information flow? And how do the various folktale populations cluster in Europe? And so this is interesting in terms of studying folktales, but hopefully it's also interesting more generally in terms of a type of cultural replication. So these are the locations where the folktales were sampled from, where the dots represent the number of samples. The size of the dots represents the number of samples from each location, so we get a good coverage across Europe. And just very quickly, the data looks something like this. So across the top, you can have different types of traits. So they might be features like where the main protagonist meets the other characters. It could be coded according to criteria like at the bottom of a well or by a river or in a field, the different variants that we see in the population. And then along the side there are the different folktale variants. And so if a particular tale from Bulgaria, say here, has a particular trait, so that the person was met at the bottom of a well, then they get a 1 there. If they don't, they get a 0 there. You can code the data that way. And then calculate the distances between all the tales using, we used a Jacquard dissimilarity matrix. It didn't really matter what particular distance metric we used. But Jacquard distances have the advantage that they standardize for the number of traits observed for each pair. So shared absences don't contribute to similarity. Geographic distance was calculated using a Haversine formula. And then we also had an estimate of language distance from, I showed you that Indo-European language tree on the first slide from that paper. And an ethno-linguistic identity score, so just whether they were in the same or different ethno-linguistic group. And what we found, this is not shown very well, the font's changed, but so geography is a geographic distance, in particular logged geographic distance, explains a significant proportion of the variance, about 9%. This is in individual folktale differences. So there are about 700 folktales, so there's a few 100,000 distances. And ethno-linguistic group explains a bit less, and language distance explains less. Again, they're all significant predictors. This is what, so I showed you that plot of genetic distance versus geographic distance across Europe from John November's paper. This is a similar kind of plot based on our cultural data, but it's just showing averages for each time interval. So you can see that as you get further and further out from, two tails sampled further and further apart, the correlation between them drops. Same kind of thing you'd see with isolation by distance in genetics. I'm not sure how much to make of this, but it's sort of interesting that in genetics across Europe, it's about 1,500 kilometers before the correlation is essentially 0. And there's a slightly lower value here, like more like 800 kilometers for cultural traits. So that might suggest that they vary over a smaller spatial scale, or they're correlated over a smaller spatial scale. So we can also look at the correlations between geographic and folktale distance, or ethno-linguistic distance, or language distance, controlling for the other distances. And when we do that, what we find is that geography seems to be explaining most of the distance, and language doesn't explain very much at all. So this suggests that these tales aren't or weren't inherited down the Indo-European ethno-linguistic or linguistic lineages. There's some variance explained by geography, by ethno-linguistic identity controlling for geography, and I'll say a bit more about that shortly. No, I'm going to say something about it right now. So, can we quantify the effect of ethno-linguistic boundaries? So there's the results I just showed you said there is an effect of distance on how similar two folktales are, and there is an effect of whether or not the folktales are in the same culture on how similar they are. And they're independent effects, but how big are they relative to one another? Can we kind of get a handle on that? And we can have a go at that. So it turns out that, so you can quantify the effect size for the ethno-linguistic effect and compare that to the geographic distance effect. And it turns out that the effect of an ethno-linguistic boundary is about the same as multiplying the geographic distance by 10. It's a multiplicative effect because the relationship is with log of geographic distance. So two cultures, two folktales in the same culture that are 10 kilometers apart are about as similar as no, I got that round the wrong way. Two folktales in, ignore the slide, two folktales in different cultures that are separated by so they're separated by an ethno-linguistic boundary, and they're only 10 kilometers apart, are about as similar to one another as two folktales in the same culture that are about 100 kilometers apart. So we can also quantify folktale variance within and between cultures. So we get about 9% variation within, 90% variation within cultures, 9% between cultures. So that compares, it's a bit higher than what we get genetically. So around the world, we get about 1 to 5% variation between ethno-linguistic groups genetically. Here we're getting 9% between this cultural trait. The other thing I was going to say is, so that this is just within Europe though, and when you just look within Europe, the genetic difference between ethno-linguistic groups is really small. It's much less than 1%. So actually, cultural variation between the groups is higher than genetic variation. And Adrian Bell published a paper a couple of years ago in PNAS looking at attitudes and values and found something similar. This is argued to support the idea or the potential of cultural group selection over genetic group selection, because you get bigger differences between groups. It might be a moot point though, because probably the most obvious differences between groups are institutional, and so aren't these kind of ephemeral traits. And so these values of about around 10% compare, they're about the same as what other people have found looking at cultural traits. We can also look, so if you find stable differences or significant differences at the cultural level, then you can ask, well, what are the distances between the cultures rather than the individual folktales? And what explains those distances? So no longer they have the ethno-linguistic effect because you're looking at ethno-linguistic groups, but you've got geography and language. And so geography explains about 15% of the variance. Log geographic distance is a bit less, so it looks like just a linear effect of geographic distance is best. When you look at the linguistic and geographic effects together, it's geography that's doing the work, and language is no longer significant. This is a plot showing the correlation between folktales across cultures at a given distance. This just shows the clusters of folktales. So we know how far apart different cultures are in their folktales, and then we can ask, this is called a splits graph, which tries to kind of represent the differences in 2 dimensions, where splits indicate, where the parallel lines indicate splits in the data, separating different traits. And you don't have too much time to go into it, but you get clear geographic groupings that sort of give a sense of the cultural landscape of Europe at the time that this folktale was spreading. So you get a kind of southeastern, eastern, northern, and then this one is Central and Western Europe. This group here is interesting because it includes English, Irish, Scottish, Danish, Latvian, and German. Not an obvious geographic grouping, but there was, over the last few hundred years, a lot of contact between those countries. So just quickly, is this of any relevance beyond folktales? Well, I think it is. We're looking, so just relating it to the goals that were outlined in the program for the conference, we're looking at units and levels and mechanisms, I think, rather than ignoring within population variation. We ought to be going out and quantifying it, and these are some methods that can do that. We're looking at horizontal versus vertical transmission in the sense that testing between the phylogenetic versus the diffusion, geographic diffusion models, and trying to quantify particular boundaries. And this is relevant to questions about cultural group selection. And also linking microscale within population processes to macroscale patterns generated by the cultural equivalent of mutation, selection, gene flow, and drift. And I think probably we can make the most progress by doing more of this and comparing different elements of culture to kind of build up a science of the population genetics of cultural traits. So we could do this with languages rather than assuming that they fit a tree-like structure, and also fitting spatial models to language variation. So one of the things I was going to talk about but don't have time is that there's these trees, we often just show them on a slide like this, and there's a clear temporal dimension, right? It's represented in the tree. But these also exist in space as well as time, and we often don't represent that. But each of these points has a location. We can map the location, and then we can infer the ancestral location back in time. If you do that for this Indo-European tree, you can say something about where it originated. So here time is color, and now the location of different points on the tree are plotted on this map and colored by time. And so this suggests an origin in Anatolia. This was some work I did with some epidemiologists. And I don't have time to talk about this at all, but you can also get some interesting geographic patterns looking at religious features. So these are beliefs about different gods around the world, and there's clear geographic clustering there as well. Okay, I better stop there. Thank you very much.